Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Round the Table, another week, and we are cracking through Mark. We are in Mark 4, chapter 14. So let's see how we do. This is a long chapter, so I know we did the whole of chapter 13 last week, but I suspect we will not do all of chapter 14 this week. In fact, I hope we don't. We'll be missing some if we do that. So Edmund, I am just going to share my screen, which is that one. Could you read Mark 14, 1 to 11, please?
1, 2, where's 11? Oh, it's over the page. Okay. It was now 2 days before Pesach, that is the festival of Matzah, and the head priests and the Torah teachers were trying to find some way to arrest Yeshua surreptitiously and have him put to death. For, they said, not during the festival or the people will riot. While he was in Bethany, in the house of Simon, a man who'd had leprosy, and as he was eating, a woman came with an alabaster jar of perfume, pure oil of nard, very costly. She broke the jar and poured the perfume over Yeshua's head. But some there angrily said to themselves, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for a year's wages and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But he said, "Let her be. Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing for me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want to, you can help them. But you'll not always have me." What she could do, she did do. In advance, she poured perfume on my body to prepare it for burial. Yes, I tell you that wherever in the whole world this good news is proclaimed, what she has done will be told in her memory. And then Judas from Kerioth, who was one of the 12, went to the head priest in order to betray Yeshua to them. They were pleased to hear this and promised to give him money, and he began to look for a good opportunity to betray Yeshua.
Thank you, Edmund. Let's just... Oh. So the commentator says, this sequence opens with a new temporal note. This has no necessary chronological link to the preceding sections. And he says, going forward, there are repeating temporal notes giving a degree of precision to the course of events. Where, from comparing John and Matthew's accounts, it's clear that the plot to get Jesus was led by Caiaphas. Edmund, any thoughts on this little intro?
This is no, really, I suppose it's when we get to the Last Supper that I've got stuff on that, except that I was trying to work out, and I always get it mixed up, the different commentators. You have Passover, and then you have, because it's all linked together, it tends to be put together as one, the week of the Festival of Unleavened Bread. And I was trying to work out how that relates to Passover. There are 4 days between when you pick the lamb, and that's taken into the home, so just enough time for the kids to get attached to it before it is then taken. And that's quite deliberate, in order to see that this is costly, this Passover. It's not something that happens out distance, it's there. And so there is a sacrifice of life, and that makes it real for the children. At least that's one of the explanations I've seen of how that's incorporated these days in the family. We talked on a previous week about when Jesus chucked out the money changers and whatnot, a lot of Jews commenting on that passage will talk about him clearing out the house, which is the word always used for the temple, but like the Passover, clearing it of the leaven, which is not to be touched. So Jesus is going through the Passover symbology, they suggest, in clearing out the money changers and all that sort of thing, as you would clear out the unclean leaven. So there's that pattern following through there.
Yeah, the commentary says that the Passover designates the festival of redemption celebrated on the 14th of the month of Nisan, which is in April or May, continuing into the early hours of the 15th. I should think Nisan's more March and April. Continuing into the early hours of the 15th between sunset and midnight. This was followed immediately by the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th to the 21st days of the month. So, yeah. It says in popular usage, the two festivals were merged and treated for practical purposes as the 7-day feast of the Passover. Just as a little bit of background. Also says during the festival season, the population of Jerusalem swelled from about 50,000 people to 250,000 people. Demonstrations and riots could always be expected, especially on the part of the excitable Galileans, among whom were many potential supporters of Jesus. The reference in verse 2 then is to the noise and confusion of an excited crowd. When mob fever, intensified by the hope of redemption associated with the Passover, could seize the people and the situation become uncontrollable.
That's interesting, because I've seen very much bigger figures suggested for everybody
Josephus
coming
does.
up for the celebrations.
Yeah, Josephus does, but he does stretch things
Yeah.
a tad.
What does Josephus say?
Well, he talks of millions.
Yes, I've seen.
2 million?
I have seen at the top end 2 million plus, but mostly around 1.5 million. Most of the figures given.
Yeah, that sounds a little stretchy for a Middle Eastern city in those days.
Except that everybody is commanded to go up to the temple 3 times a year.
Yeah.
And people did travel, the elderly and the infirm obviously would be looking after the homes and what have you. But given the population, and I read somewhere about the number of synagogues there were in Jerusalem, which served the feast times. And it's hundreds of them I mean, they were almost like pop-up synagogues as far as I can work it out. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So that does seem to point to very large numbers. I mean, obviously, if your population is normally 25,000 and it goes up 10 times, that would still be described in that way. So.
Could it have been a bit like in this country? There were hundreds of little churches everywhere, weren't there? Didn't mean it was a massive population.
Well, mostly those synagogues that were being talked about were like mothballed most of the time, because they were just for. And you've got that one in Acts where the so-called synagogue of freedmen, who were actually foreigners, mostly Cretans and whatever, who obviously use that place when it comes to the feasts. They're not there most of the time, and they're the ones that accuse Stephen, but they're not there when he's put in court, and he says they ought to be here if they've got something to say, which technically they should have been.
The other thing, we think of synagogue as building, but you've got to think of synagogue as a group of people.
Yeah.
So there were synagogues within the temple complex.
Yeah.
When they met in the temple complex, after the day of Pentecost, that was a synagogue, a synagogue. They were a gathering of people that were called out together. There were many would happen simultaneously, as my understanding of it. Anyway.
Yeah, I just heard something this week which was making exactly that point, that when they gathered together in the Porch of Solomon, it's described as a synagogue.
Yeah.
But it means just the people gathering.
Yeah.
A get together. They were hanging out.
Yeah, I've just had a little delve on Wikipedia, and the estimates for the population of Jerusalem were between 20 and 100,000 at that time.
Right.
But it does say that Tacitus, the Roman historian, quotes the population of Jerusalem as 600,000,
right.
Which there's no way it would be 600,000. It's not that big a city.
If a Roman legion comes in and kills 20, it's not a big deal. But if you kill 600,000, then that's a big deal. That's a big victory. So that could have been some Roman upgrading for political purposes.
Yeah. So
it's good, Dave, actually.
It could be 50,000. It could be 20,000. It could be 100,000 population. But it's hard to say. I mean, you would have thought that possibly they should have had figures because there was the census, wasn't there? So, there were various censuses around that time, but it's whether those figures have actually been preserved. But they would have known because of the census.
Can I ask a question, though?
Say a second.
I just wanted to ask something because, it has always, come to my mind because they would say every time Jesus went to a city, he met at the synagogue, or every time even the disciples, the apostles, they would always go to the synagogue. And I've always assumed that, if you're running away from this city or from this town, why would you go to the synagogue where they would easily? So in my mind, there was always a physical structure. Are you saying that it didn't have to be within the temple? Or was it a gathering of, people still within the temple? Or, could it have been anywhere and you could still call it a synagogue?
Anywhere.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that when Paul goes to Thessalonica, there's debate, but a probable situation is that although on another level I find that unusual given Thessalonica being the level of Roman city it was, but some people suggest there wasn't a synagogue there building as such, but there would have been a place for gathering which would be called a synagogue, which it says in Acts the place of prayer because there was water there, because you always needed running water if you were going to gather to be before God because of the ritual cleansing of the mikveh. So whether there's a building there or whether it just people got together, which was also the synagogue. So there's an example, which is why they're not sure, it seems to me, whether exactly what the situation was.
A follow-up question, because I know that also that in those times, it was difficult to get the scrolls. And it had to be handled carefully and they handed over to you and then you read it for everybody. Are you saying that also that it's not what I used to think? Could you just have access to the scrolls, your own copy, in those days and you read it amongst yourselves?
No,
you're extremely rich, hyper rich to have the scroll.
Of your own, yeah.
Yep. Just one scroll.
Because the school was attached to the synagogue, and the guy I listen to an awful lot on these things says he has never seen in over decades, every synagogue he's seen, whether it was ancient or modern, always has a school hall attached to it, to the complex. And they would always have a scroll because the teacher, which is where we get the term rabbi, it's not an ordained position, but the teacher in the school always has a scroll because he teaches the children to recite and learn from a school. So every Beth Sefer, which is the basic school, like primary up to secondary, they always have a scroll. So you would have wherever the school was, there would be a scroll. But ordinary people, unless they were extremely wealthy or instructed by God, which the king was, he always had to write his own scroll and keep it with him so that he didn't get above himself, says God, and sees that he's just like the rest of the people, which I think is a very interesting instruction. Everybody else, they would go to the Torah teacher who would access the local scroll if needed.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I heard once that in the Essene community where they were copying scrolls in the scriptorum, that it was taking 5 people to write one scroll. Only one person writing. One person recites, one person copies, one person looks over the shoulder, one person checks, and then there's a last check after that. So 5 people doing one scroll. So it was a huge time commitment and a huge money commitment as well. Millions of pounds you're talking about, really, in those sorts of days. If we bulk it up from their days, the time commitment was phenomenal.
Yeah, and that meets the question you often get from folk who say, oh, you know, these things must change over the years. They were so exact over the copying that you could have almost completed a whole scroll of Isaiah, which is the biggest one, which has more than Isaiah in it. It's basically one of the 2 or 3 scrolls to do with the prophets. And you make one mistake on a letter, you don't correct it, you discard the whole scroll.
Whoa.
You don't just remove the sheet, you discard the whole scroll. So they're extremely careful when they're transcribing.
And also, it's not just the manpower, it's the actual creation of the scroll itself.
Yes,
yeah.
Which
That's why you find that the Ethiopian eunuch, he came from a royal court, and he had the Isaiah scroll, it sounds like, and probably that's the only scroll he had.
Yeah.
But it was extremely valuable. He was the only one the queen was the only one who had the money to purchase that sort of document.
Yeah.
So
and even now, the people who copy the scrolls for the synagogue, they use a quill. They still use the old techniques, and the ink is made in the same way that's always been made.
Yes.
And you write it with a quill. You don't write it with modern stuff at all. You follow exactly the same procedure.
Yeah.
So, moving on. So we managed 2 verses there. Excellent. So then we've got this beautiful story of the lady, you know, who, if the incident is identical with the anointing reported in John, then the anonymous woman here would be recognized as Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, but we don't know whether it's the same. It sounds like it could be. So the commentator says at the same time that men were conspiring about his death, his body was prepared for burial through an act that expressed faith and love. So this is why Mark puts this here. It's a counterpoint to what's happening with the leadership, showing that, you know, the leaders who are supposed to be leading the nation in the ways of God are conspiring to kill God, whilst this woman is recognizing who he is and anointing his body. Bethany was on the Mount of Olives, 2 miles from Jerusalem. So, you know, a half an hour, 40-minute walk away. And nard is apparently extracted from a root found in India. So it would have been extremely valuable. It would have been sealed in a long-necked flask whose neck would have to be broken to release the oil. Now, I did read something, and I have no idea, I couldn't actually bottom out whether this was true or not, that people at the time had tear bottles, which were long-necked bottles that they would catch their tears if something major happened, and that those that they would actually keep them with them through their life, and that those bottles would have something like nard in them to preserve the tears. Now, which sounds like a wonderful, wonderful story, that she broke her tear bottle and anointed his feet. So it's like with tears and with an ointment. But I haven't actually been able to bottom out whether that's an urban myth or not. Edmund?
I haven't heard about the nard bit. There's a reference in
Revelation
in the Old Testament
yeah.
about keep my tears in your bottle or something like that. I can't quite remember how it goes, but that's a reference to that thing. But I don't know about mixing it with nard. That sounds as if it's. I can't remember all the details about the tear bottles, but this was a part of the mourning process. And it's like the thought that struck me when I read it was, sorry, I can't remember more details, but that it's a bit like, you know, go in some house and there's this sort of pot on the mantelpiece and they say, oh, that's my husband's ashes. Mm. Do you know what I mean? It's a sort of memorial. And tear bottles were something in that sort of direction, as a sort of memory of the person for whom, and you would they're very small, so I'm not sure if nard would be in them.
Yeah, I just read it and I can't remember where I read it, but I did a little bit of research at the time and I couldn't actually bottom out whether there was any truth to it or not.
Yeah, I just saw. So I just googled it. You know, tears and nard. It's actually on Wikipedia as well just now, but it doesn't say it was her tears in the bottle mixed with nard, or probably she was crying as she was anointing his feet. It doesn't put them together. But yes, it mentioned the fact that there was tears and there was nard when she was doing that.
Out of interest, you were saying about the tangle about who the woman is. That's been a sort of tangle in the West ever since Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, decided that you know, in the Pharisees' house when the woman of ill repute came in, Gregory got it all mixed up and put it together with Mary Magdalene and with Mary of Bethany. So he makes Mary of Bethany into an ex-prostitute and does all sorts of, and suddenly it eventually got sorted out quite recently. Pope Benedict formally declared that Mary of Bethany, who anointed Jesus with the nard, was not the same as this woman of ill repute that all the painters paint, and it has nothing to do with Mary Magdalene, who just mixed up all these people. Anybody that was called Mary, he sort of seems to have lumped into one woman. Yeah. But if you're in the East, the Eastern Church pooh-hooed at Gregory at the time in very definite manner and said, this is nothing to do with that, and explain it just exactly as Pope Benedict has now done, or, well, he did before he left the job.
Yeah, I mean, in John, it says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served whilst Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with them. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume.
See, that wouldn't fit with a tear bottle, would it?
No, that's true. It's too big. A pint.
That's quite a lot, isn't it?
That's a lot of tears.
I was told, I don't know how true it is, well, I believe the first part of it, that the smell of the nard would have absolutely filled the house.
Yeah.
But the bit I don't know about, or I thought, is that true, is that he would have been drenched with it, and his clothes would still have smelt of it 3 days later when he was crucified.
Mm.
Now, that's an interesting image. Whether it's true or not, I don't know.
What is nard? Does anybody know what nard is?
It's extracted from a root found in India.
Oh, right.
Belongs to the Valerian family.
Oh, yes, the plant man, he'll know.
Have you ever smelt it, Dave?
Well, if it's the same family, it says it's from. I just had a look to see what it was, and it says valerian. And actually, valerian grows in this country.
Yeah.
It's a herbaceous plant, and the root has a particular. It does have an odor to it, but I think this is probably something else. But I don't have anything that I could readily look at it. I mean, I might have a quick go, but yeah. So it does. It has a kind of a. Yeah, the one that grows in England does, but I'm sure this is something more. And of course, when you extract an essential oil, it intensifies. So,
and valerian is used in medicines.
Yes, it is. It's a complementary medicine. Yeah,
used a lot. Very popular in medieval times.
Yeah.
According to Wikipedia, it's spikenard.
Oh, spikenard. Oh, well, that's different
Same
again,
thing.
isn't it?
That's the same.
It is aromatic amber-coloured oil. And it says the oil's been used over centuries as a perfume, a traditional medicine, or in religious ceremonies.
Yeah, it is used in votive.
But it says historically the name nard also referred to essential oils derived from other species, valerian, Spanish lavender. So it could be any of those. Yeah,
that was the valerian that led me down there. So
yeah, so it could be either really.
Whatever it was very valuable. It was 300. It was worth 300 denarii.
Yeah,
a denarii was a labourer's day wage.
Wages. Yeah.
So it said it was worth a year's salary.
Yeah, at least.
So that was a chunk of money.
Yeah.
And particularly in those days, because when people were on a day wage, that's what they lived on for the day. So to actually save that much money. I mean, obviously, Mary and Martha and Lazarus obviously came from good stock then. If she had access to 300 day wage of money just for perfume, they must have been very well to do.
Not necessarily, because that might have been like a kind of dowry being built up.
Yeah,
because you didn't necessarily keep a dowry in coinage. You keep it in precious metals. That nard would be tradable.
Yeah,
because there is a suggestion that Bethany actually was a leper colony.
Oh, really?
Did you come across that? Yeah, because there's Simon the leper there, and it apparently it crops up in an Essene document about it. But anyway.
Interesting, but
they would be poor if it was.
Well, yeah, I'm not someone who had 300 had a year's worth of wages that they'd managed to accumulate. I don't believe would have been poor in that environment. That's a whole year of work, and it's hard enough nowadays to save up a whole year's salary. Never mind.
Yeah, but was that Judas's valuation of it?
No,
he was a pretty shoot. Because he was the one who complained about it, wasn't he?
It doesn't say here that he did. I think it does in John.
Probably does in John.
It does.
Anyway,
it just says some of those present were saying indignant to one another, "Why is this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, and the money given to the poor." I think John possibly does say it was.
Yes, John tends to focus it down, and you notice as you go through the earliest gospel, which is Mark, as you progress through, you'll find they come down harder and harder, and more specifically on Judas. So the Mark one doesn't say his name, but from then on, it gets heavier and heavier. John has the nastiest things to say about Judas.
If you want to buy it today, a little tiny pot of spikenard or nard oil costs you £1,186.23 on eBay.
Essential.
It's only a little.
So there you go. It's still worth a lot of money.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So it says, the commentator says, it was customary to remember the poor with gifts on the evening of Passover. It was also the practice to give as charity one part of the second tithe normally spent in Jerusalem during the feast. Do you know about the second tithe, Edmund?
I'm dealing with the whole question of tithes. If I say I understand the process, but we've misunderstood what a tithe is biblically. A tithe is never money in the scriptures. There is one verse in the New Testament where Jesus is talking about the Pharisee and the publican, and the Greek, he says, I give a tithe of everything I have. So you could argue that could include money as well. But every other reference to the tithes go into storehouses, like a tithe barn in Bradford-on-Avon. That's stuff. And if you look at the ones in the Old Testament, it's almost always associated with your crops.
Yeah.
So I'll bring all my runner beans to the forum in the summer then.
Yep.
I believe that they were allowed to exchange the tithe for cash when they were traveling up.
They were coming from a big distance, and then you'd swap it back into an animal of your choice, and you got to Jerusalem. So there is a money association there. And obviously in our context, I'm not saying we throw out what we do, but the tithes generally means stuff.
Yeah.
So that you tithe mint and dill and cumin. But
it was an agrarian society, so they produced produce, and therefore they would tithe the produce. Yes.
But I mean, just as I'm not putting this on anybody else, but since that stuck in my face, somebody else commented to me about it, and I thought, what? And I went and looked, and they were right. And it set me thinking about, in these days of gifting food aid and all that sort of thing for people in the local community. And I was thinking, oh, yeah, we used to have things in the foyer of the forum that you could drop things in week by week. And that set me thinking about that. And I think, so if I was really thinking of it in a biblical sense, I would go and do my shop and then divide that by 9 and add whatever that result was on top, which I would then deposit. And then I imagined all the shops had things which were to go to things like the food bank or whatever. And I thought, that would provide for all the homeless.
Oh, they still do, Edmund. If you go to Sainsbury's, they've got...
Yes, I know they still do. But I mean, if it was part of our culture, that every shop had things that you could put things in if you wished to, I thought, yeah, I can see, Lord, it would work.
I
wouldn't have thought of dividing my weekly shop by 9 and then adding another of those to the top to give a 10th.
Yeah, I mean, we don't get paid in stuff. I mean, in an agrarian society, what you produce is stuff. So you give a 10th of your stuff. But in our society, we're paid in money. We're not paid in stuff. And so whether we give the money or whether we convert the money into stuff and then give that, it's a moot point, really. But money is just an easy.
It set me thinking in different ways about.
Yeah, I'm sure in an agrarian society, they give in
the temple. You have the treasury, which is gifts and money and silver and gold and all those sorts of things, objects. And then you have the storehouses, which is for the food and the provisions that will feed the priests and the whatnot. That's how it technically worked. And of course, you've got the big tithe barn down at Bradford-on-Avon, which was exactly that. It fed the parish priest and what have you.
Yeah, Preston's got a tithe barn as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So, there was this, people complaining about the waste of money. And the commentator, I just thought this was a wonderful way of describing it. He says the contrast is not between Jesus and the poor, but between always and not always. that the poor will always be amongst you, but Jesus will not always be amongst you. So I just thought it was wonderful. The contrast is not between Jesus and the poor, but between always and not always. I just think gives it a wonderful context. This is the one chance to do this to Jesus' body. Whilst the poor, always. They're always going to be there. You can always do this. And, you know, she gets a wonderful testimony. You know, and Jesus says, wherever the gospel's preached, this she will be talked about. And Mark made sure that she was. He made sure that was in there. And John and the others made sure it was in there. So she gets covered off. It's beautiful.
When I did my thesis back in the 90s, one of the books, it's just sitting on the bookshelf by me. If you remember, that was all the time when you got feminist theology and stuff floating around the place. And one of the books I used is actually called, by a well-known woman theologian, In Memory of Her, which is a pretty apt title if you're going to look at the theology of feminism. In Memory of Her, from this incident.
Yeah, and then Judas. Go on.
I was going to say, just going to say about that last phrase. I like that contrast. On the poor you always have with me. That took me back to Isaiah 58:6, which says, "This is the fast that I have chosen, to break the chains of wickedness, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, to tear off every yoke. Isn't this that you should to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and the homeless into your home, to clothe the naked," and so on. And just wonder whether that was at the back of Mark's mind as he was writing, and that was, of course, the you know, all of these high days and holidays. One of the mitzvot would be to actually give alms to the poor, not only give it to the temple, but it would be to support the poor, and to give to the poor. That was an important mitzvah.
Well, I don't know if it's still a tradition, but it used to be in my young days for the gentlemen of the road, as we then called the tramps and the homeless. They all knew when the high days and holidays were on at the synagogue, and they'd all be down there, because whenever you came out from the synagogue, particularly on Yom Kippur, you were handing out money like there was no tomorrow, and everybody knew and went down the synagogue because they were going to get handouts.
There isn't a synagogue in Bath, is there, anymore?
No, it left in the 70s. Although someone told me recently that there used to be another one. They did tell me where. Is it by that St. John's Hospital, that old hospital near the old cinema? You know, the
little theatre.
Yeah, that's it. I'm not sure, but apparently there was another one, but it was much older. But it used to be near the Saracen's Head. But when they redeveloped it for the Hilton and all that complex there, Waitrose and all of that, they bought the land and took away the synagogue, and they all now go over to Bristol, which means they're going further than a Sabbath day journey. I was like,
perhaps they go on a Thursday,
because otherwise I'd be in the synagogue regularly.
Perhaps they go Friday afternoon and stay over.
That would certainly be what some of the more Orthodox would do.
Well, it's all done on Zoom, isn't it?
Yeah. I've not seen any Orthodox in Bath ever.
No, I have one Jewish friend who became a believer in the young people's group from Hay Hill, and I have recently been in contact with him again, but I can't quite track down. I know that a number of them live up in the part of the world, the Royal Crescent and all that, because they're quite they're the upper end of the Jewish society, the ones we've got in Bath, which is not surprising. But I did know Mad Eli, as he was called, who was a a character who was on Walcott Street. He had a sort of a stall and stuff. And
I remember Mad Eli, Eddie. I remember him.
do you remember Mad Eli?
Yeah, back in the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Before my
after
time.
Lord got hold of me, I came out of Hay Hill one day, and I mean, Mad Eli was hardly respectable. But I came out of the side of Hay Hill, and all of a sudden there was Mad Eli, and it was like the spirit just hit me, and I just suddenly thought, he's Jewish. And I was so excited that he was the first Jew I met after the Lord had got hold of me. And everything inside me was absolutely, just exploding with joy, being confronted with dear old Mad Eli, who was hardly an example of a respectable Jewish character. You remember him, Gray?
Yeah, I do.
There's a Jewish burial ground up on Coombe Down, right opposite where they're doing that new Mulberry estate.
Right.
Oh.
On the corner.
There's a couple of Jewish burial grounds around, I think. In Bath.
Interesting.
There's one I think there's one in Widcombe as well. Widcombe.
Yeah, that would fit because there used to be a. Yeah.
Right.
I think that's an oversight on the Lord's part that he has not put me in connection with a Jewish synagogue.
Right, moving on, Edmund. So then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priest to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So the commentator's it just says, there is no mention of motive, and to assign one is conjecture. Because you hear often that, why did Judas do this? But I think that's just a great comment. There's no mention of motive, and to assign one is conjecture. So you can talk about as much as you want, but it's conjecture. So has anyone got any questions or comments about those 10 and 11 before we just do a little bit more? No? Edmund, could you read, hang on a minute, share screen. It's not to 26, to 16. 12 to 16, please.
12 to 6. Oh, not all the way to 26. Okay.
No, just 12 to 16.
Yeah, okay. On the first day for Matzah, when they slaughtered the lamb for Pesach, Yeshua's disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare your Seder?" He sent two of his disciples with these instructions: "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. And whichever house he enters, tell the owner that the rabbi says, 'Where's the guest room for me where I can eat the Pesach meal with my disciples?' He'll show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make the preparations there." The disciples went off, came to the city, and found things just as he told them they would be, and they prepared the Seder.
So the Passover had to be eaten within the city walls of Jerusalem, hence they had to return to the city. And a commentator says it would be unusual to see a man carrying a water jar, as usually only women would do that. Men would be seen carrying wineskins, but not water jars. Jesus had obviously prearranged this, and it was to avoid him being seen in the city. The Passover meal began after sunset and could last until midnight. So it was observed as a night of watching unto the Lord, in the conviction that in that night they were redeemed, and in that night they will be redeemed in the future, which is from a Targum.
Yep.
So Any comments on this, Edmund, in the last few minutes we've got?
One of the things I've always thought about is you'll have seen that some of the commentators, there's debate about whether this is a proper Passover meal or it's something else and what day it is and all that sort of tangle, which I sidestep. I wasn't there, so I can't tell you definitively which one it was. But a thing which has always bugged me is that Passover meals are normally family. Where are the women? Who did the cooking? I mean, this guy and the guy with the water pot, the situation where that could happen is if he's a widower and he has no one else except a single servant in the house. So there are no women there. Do you know what I mean? So this guy is carrying the water pot. But I mean, what happens with family? You would normally be, do you know what I mean? So I often wonder if when we get to see the replay, we'll discover that we're used to just thinking there were these 12 guys there with Jesus. But in fact, family were there as well and other people. I mean, I don't know, but it's bugged me since the 70s.
Well, it does say that he will show you a large upper room.
Yeah.
Now, if there's only 13 of you, you don't need that big a room, do you? You just need a room.
It says, the general thing I came across recently, it tends to be the maximum is about 20 at a Passover meal, and you have to have at least, it says if there's only a few of you in the house, join with the neighbour next door.
That's right,
when you're dividing up your lamb. Do you know what I mean? So is it between a minimum of 10, which would be a minyan, up to a maximum of 20? But like you say, it's a large upper room. But it does make me think that these Passovers, which us well-meaning Christians organise where there are 50, 60 people and someone leads the Seder meeting. And I think it's rather a long way from what it's meant to be, doing it like
it is a family event, isn't it?
Yeah.
I wonder, the other thing is, the trouble is we have a tendency to bring our modern buildings into first century Jerusalem. And it was much more crammed together. I was only talking about this on Sunday, and I think the buildings were smaller. There were, the guest rooms would have been built sort of on top or an addition somewhere. And where it says large might be a relative term to the other parts of the building, which usually were two-part. So that would be well on the guy carrying the water jug. There is another option. Because there was, from what I understand, there was an Essene community within Jerusalem, and that would give you an option for carrying water jars, because they tended to be men communities. So that would give you another option.
And they certainly they got on very well with the Christians in the early days of the church. The Essenes and the Christians were often talking from the same hymn sheet in many things, as opposed to what the Sadducees would have been saying or whatever. They particularly liked the idea of Jesus as the new high priest, because they considered the current ones completely illegitimate. That's put it mildly.
I mean, it does come up a bit later in this chapter, but the tradition is that it was actually Mark's family home where the Lord's Supper happened. Mark, who's writing the Gospel.
Yeah, that's another option.
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah,
it's possible.
Well, it comes from which we will cover when we get to it, when the young man flees when the arrest of Jesus and leaves his clothes behind. The tradition is that was Mark.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they tie it back to this house as well, but I don't know what. It's just the tradition, the church fathers' tradition. So I am going to pause our recording now.